So yeah, you've worked there for 15 years. What made you want to work there in the first place?
Well, I grew up in London. I've always been into film. Film's always been my big passion. So BFI just seemed like a kind of obvious destination. I guess a place that I used to visit when I was younger. It was a really kind of formative place for me in terms of expanding my film tastes and horizons. I remember when I first kind of discovered and it really introduced me to sorts of filmmakers that I didn't know about. And I think it was one of the places that kind of led to my deeper interest and understanding in film. So I think I had an idea of the BFI as a place that I wanted to work, but it wasn't, initially I hadn't kind of planned on festivals. That wasn't a destination that I specifically had in mind. I just wanted to be at BFI. And it was a kind of, journey of kind of getting there and understanding what I wanted to be doing and then landing in festivals and realizing that was kind of where a real passion of mine laid.
Oh, brilliant. And so your current title is Senior Programmer for both BFI Flair and London Film Festival. What is the job of I guess, A, a programmer, and B, a senior programmer?
Sure. So, I mean, I started just to, a little bit of kind of, I guess, history and context of like how I've kind of, my job's gone at BFI. I started, as you said, nearly 15 years ago. I did an internship, which was in the marketing department. I mean, to be honest, I had no huge interest in film marketing, wasn't where my interests lied. But I knew that, as I said, I wanted to be at BFI. So it was a kind of opportunity. And that was working in the marketing team during what was then called the London Lesbian and Gay Film Festival, which is now BFI Flair. And through then I made some kind of contacts with people, got talking to people, let people know that I was very interested in film and perhaps marketing wasn't exactly where I wanted to be, and I would be interested in moving more to the kind of programming curation side of things. And then a job the following year came up, which was a assistant level role in the festival's program team. So I'd be booking flights, researching films, doing admin, that kind of thing. And through then, a programming opportunity came up on BFI Flair, and it kind of led on from there, and now has led to me being senior programmer across both festivals. So programming, film programming, in the most basic sense, is programming is another word for kind of curation. If you work in a gallery, you're a curator. If you work in film exhibition, you're a programmer. So you are kind of responsible for choosing and selecting films that are exhibited to the public. So, with film festivals, that for me involves working through and doing a lot of research and viewing on the kind of year in contemporary cinema, working with a team of other programmers to make the final selection of what we screen at the festivals. Outside of just the films and the film viewing, that can also extend to programming, events. It will be around kind of writing promotional copy for the website, for brochures. It will involve hosting on-stage Q&As with filmmaking talent. It will involve liaising and communications with distributors, sales agents, rights holders, in terms of acquiring films that we will screen at the festival, working with marketing departments, press teams, all the various kind of things of how it comes together. So the very essence is about film selection, but there's much more that kind of leads on from that in terms of putting the festival together as a whole. Back when I was just working as a film programmer, my kind of focus would be much more based around kind of film in terms of film viewing, research, and communications with the advisors that we work with, going to other film festivals, etc. And now in a more senior position, I'm slightly kind of hovering above some of that. So of course, the film viewing and selection is very much key to what I do. But my role's kind of extended to working with other teams and departments at BFI in terms of putting together the festival as a whole and what the overall kind of I guess what the festival wants to be, what we want to achieve, and how we can make that happen. So it becomes slightly more cross department, and takes me a little bit away from just the programming side.
It's a big remit then, I suppose, of different departments and things you've got your hands in there as well. So focusing more on the programming curation side of it, how do you develop, I guess, a palette for the kind of films that you enjoy, and I guess how do you know what's a good film to be able to say this is perfect for what we want, which I guess is kind of what it all kind of boils down to.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think kind of in its kind of essence, being a film programmer is kind of managing the balance between your own tastes and the expectations, or how much you understand audiences that you're trying to attract, or who you think might enjoy this film. So I think personal taste is something that's always going to be there, and I think it's always something that you should listen to and respond to. But you need to be watching a film through 1,000 different eyes if you're a film programmer. Much of my job, and when I tell someone what I do, and break it down and be like, I watch films and I select them for to be screened at film festivals. People are like, wow, that's the greatest job in the whole world. And don't get me wrong, it's a really cool job. I love it a lot, but a lot of the time is spent watching films that you wouldn't obviously normally choose to watch. A lot of films that exist outside of your kind of tastes or interests. So it's kind of working out. You have slightly different eyes on when you watch a film for programming purposes. You're always thinking about audiences first and foremost. You're thinking about filmmakers, who made this film, why does this film exist? Is this film saying something that kind of other films that people have access to at the moment aren't saying? This is an opportunity to spotlight filmmakers, to spotlight topics and certain things that maybe aren't being so widely discussed within the mainstream. So the kind of responsibilities of a programmer exist very much outside of yourself. I think it's really important to kind of leave your kind of ego and, to a certain extent, some of your personal tastes behind. But I think, as I said, taste is still very much informs the decisions that you make. And I think that's why it's really important for festivals and for film programmers that you don't work in isolation. For example, with the London Film Festival, we have a team of around 30 program advisors and programmers that we work with. They have different specialities in terms of regional cinema, in terms of film form, and it's very much a conversation that's had with that wider group of people. It's not a matter of one person watching a film saying, that's a yes from me, and then it ends up in the festival. Films will be second viewed, they'll be third viewed, they'll be discussed. It's very much a process that we go through. So I think that's, it's the right balance. It means that you can express your opinions, your taste, your personality can come through in your programming, but you can make sure that you're thinking about things more holistically and you're not programming purely from your kind of personal taste.
Do you find sometimes that can hinder your own enjoyment of films as far as switching off as well? Or do you know when you're in work mode watching a film, or do you have that separation at all?
I mean, I think the good thing is definitely doing this job hasn't made my kind of appetite for film any less. I mean, I'm still the same person that was at the end of the working day. In the evening for fun, I watch films. So, that's that kind of separation for me in terms of kind of film viewing doesn't necessarily exist. It's just my life is spent watching films for work and for fun. But I think that it's really important for me that I don't lose that passion for film while I'm watching stuff for work. I think I never separate myself and make it become this kind of clinical experience where I sit down to watch a film for work and I sit with my notepad and make notes. And I think that can restrict enjoyment and emotional and personal connection with film. I think a big part of people's, and one of the most important responses that people will have to film, is personal and emotional. And I think that needs to feed into what you're doing as a programmer. You need to feel a film if you're going to think about how it would work for an audience. So I try and kind of balance that bridge between every film that I'd watch for work being like, how am I feeling about this? Am I enjoying this? Do I like watching this? Would I want to watch this? How would I feel if I'd have paid £10 to buy a ticket to see this film? But also having that more kind of work face on and kind of thinking, as I said before, like, who's made this? Where's it from? What's it saying? What place does this have within the kind of festival this year, for example? So it's a kind of balancing act. But that passion, that fundamental passion and love for film always remains throughout all of my work and all of my work viewing.
Yeah, I think it's similar to, as like filmmakers as well, you do, rather than like a regular audience, you do experience film in a slightly different way because you're watching from a slightly different angle of, how these films are being made, and you're sometimes conscious of that, or often conscious of that when you're watching and experiencing them. But then, keeping that passion and that appetite for the content and keeping that alive is really important.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when I watch films for fun, the films that I watch often things that would never be in the London Film Festival. I don't sit there with a kind of critical eye looking at those and picking them apart and maybe analysing them in the same way that I might do. I can still watch and access film purely for enjoyment. I think it's really important to keep that passion alive, and that's the reason I got into it, because I love film. I love how it makes me feel. I love the experience of watching a film and how it can transport you and shift your thoughts, your feelings. That should always be fundamental to what I'm doing. So I think the day that I would lose that passion is the day that you shouldn't be a programmer anymore.
No, absolutely. And one of the perks, I guess, of being a programmer for these big festivals is you get to see these films really far in advance in some cases. How do you, obviously with short films, people submit their shorts to you. How does it work for bigger feature films? Because of course you've got some that are kind of from huge studios, but also down to feature films that are like independently funded and maybe even don't yet have a full like distributor, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you find the content?
So there's kind of various ways. If we're thinking about the London Film Festival, for example, which is the biggest festival in the UK, it's the biggest festival that that we run. It's we access and see films through a variety of different ways. So we will partly do that through, as I mentioned before, conversations and communications with distributors, kind of worldwide international sales agents, producers, filmmakers directly, kind of conversations that we'll be having. We travel to other festivals. We'll go to Berlin, to Cannes, also to some kind of smaller niche festivals. We will have our own kind of personal connections, which we will tap into, word of mouth, things like that, but also have an open submission policy across the festival where anyone can submit a film to us. So you can submit anything from a minute-long animation to a 4-hour documentary. There's a completely open submission policy that we have, and we watch all of the films that are submitted to us. For the London Film Festival, for example, we charge a submission fee. So it's you pay a fee to submit a film for us. For BFI Flair, the LGBT festival that we run, it's a free submissions policy that we have, so you don't have to pay for that one. I think that's kind of reflected in the work that is screened in the festival. And with the London Film Festival, for example, it's a smaller ratio of open submission films that make it into the final program. A lot of the films that we do program are films that might have previously screened at other festivals, might already have sales agents, distributors attached, and they're films that come to us through different sources. And we will always endeavour to select and program a selection of the films that come completely fresh to us, completely new through open submissions. But with BFI Flair, a big portion of the festival is made up through films that come directly to us from filmmakers, films that we didn't know about, films that are complete surprises to us when they arrive, in our inboxes or, added onto our very extensive databases that we work from. So we want to make sure that, particularly with BFI Flair, which is very much a community festival, is as accessible for filmmakers as possible. And as I said, that's kind of reflected in the balance of the program and how much work ends up being from open subs.
No, absolutely. And I think from my personal experience, I can speak to that particularly with BFI Flair as well, because as you know, how we met, one of my shorts got into BFI Flair. And then that, obviously you've got that year, there was a film feature film with Elliot Page and Kate Mara, and another one with Kristen Stewart. And I mean, these are all big features, and some of the talent from behind the camera of those films were also at the opening night gala with people like me who have made the shorts and on super low budget as a grad film, for example. And there is that community, and it's really accessible. Obviously, you're still essentially, it's curated, so obviously you're not guaranteed to get in, but I think I was surprised at how accessible it was once you've got in to the different levels of talent and how they're treated as well. It was, as you described it, a real community feel.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, such, a huge part of festivals is obviously festivals exist for audiences and they exist for exhibiting film, but I think, you know, the kind of industry side and from the side of filmmakers or delegates that come into the festival, that opportunity of access to meet people, to have conversations, to access different events, whether it's industry events, see other films, etc., is such a huge part of what it is. You know, a filmmaker can then go on a kind of year festival run with a film, travel to lots of different festivals, and the information and the kind of experience they can gather through that process can be really invaluable and really informative of their career moving forward. So I think it's always really important for us, and this is part of what I was saying about how programming exists outside of just watching films. You know, this is part of what we think of. We put together an industry program, for example, for both festivals each year. You know, that has to be very carefully curated to think about and understand filmmaker experience, what different types of filmmakers, Lewis, whether it's, you know, you as a, you know, kind of relatively new filmmaker making a pretty low budget film, or it's someone, an experienced filmmaker with kind of international recognition, that both of those people are going to want different things out of the festival. But the fundamental thing that both people want is access and opportunity and opportunities to choose and make decisions. So we try and make sure that's very central to what we're doing. So you're kind of simultaneously serving audiences and industry at the same time and finding ways to make those things intersect.
And just before I ask the next question, for anyone watching, feel free to use the Q&A tab at the bottom if you have any questions for Michael, and then I'll go through them and put them to him. So with people wanting to submit to these festivals, what advice would you have for them in, well, I suppose not necessarily just the ones that you run, but with people looking to, how do they know which festivals to submit to? With what's right for them, and also how can they maximize the chances of catching someone's eye and potentially being in the official selection?
Sure. I mean, I think the, you know, first and foremost thing is just do a little bit of research of the festival before you submit a film to it. Know what the festival is, know the type of film that they program for. Something that is, I guess, has stopped being, you know, shocking to me is that we get a small number of films submitted to BFI Flair, the queer festival that we run each year, that are not queer. They're not made by queer people, have no queer content. Sometimes a filmmaker might just see that a festival has submissions open and they send their film in. You know, it's kind of frustrating for us to watch a film and to realize it wasn't, you know, the person that submitted to this festival didn't really know what the festival was and wasn't really thinking about it. So it's really important that you understand where you're submitting to and making sure that the people that you're submitting to know that you know what the festival is. It's as I said, with BFI Flair, we have a free policy to submit film to us, but London Film Festival, you do have to pay a fee, and a lot of film festivals, international film festivals, you have to pay a submission fee. So coming up with a plan of the film festivals that you want to target can be really important, especially for newcomers and emerging filmmakers who might have a relatively small budget in which to do this. So targeting specific festivals that you think are really right for the film, that you think realistically the film would have a chance of getting into, I think is really important. You know, I know that a lot of kind of filmmakers sometimes work in a festival fee kind of budget into their overall budgets, you know, thinking about once the film has ended, what resource you might have to put into reaching out to festivals and stuff. And you can go to a lot of festivals, and particularly queer festivals are free access, but the kind of bigger, some of the, you know, mainstream festivals you do have to pay for. So come up with a festival strategy can be really important. Thinking in advance about if you, as a filmmaker, want your film in that festival is important. It's not uncommon for people to submit work to us, which we really like, and then we invite the film and they turn down the invitation because they want to hold out for a different festival, or it doesn't quite work for them in terms of timelines. Again, that's a frustrating experience for us as programmers. We recognize that sometimes it happens and things change, but having a really clear idea of a festival strategy and what you want to be doing is really helpful and makes that communications with us and with programmers and festivals much smoother. In terms of, you know, what you can do to get your film noticed, I mean, this is the kind of cop-out answer, I guess, but you just make a great film. You know, that's what we respond to. We years ago when I first started the festival, we used to, when we'd be viewing from DVDs, and we'd get, 3-4 huge sacks of post would come in every day, and we'd literally open up the envelopes, go through them, fill in the information on the database, and people would send in press packs, and people would send in supplementary materials, loads of information about their film. That used to be sometimes quite useful. That doesn't really happen anymore because people submit on submission forms and send in a link for the film. I think having a clear and concise synopsis is always very helpful if that's an option to kind of fill that in an application form. Having very basic information that's clearly presented about the film. It sounds like very simple stuff, but it's really, really helpful to us. And lastly, the thing that I would say is that sometimes the temptation might be to kind of follow up lots with festivals, to kind of say, hey, I submitted my film 2 weeks ago, just checking if you had any information, etc., etc. We get a lot of those informations, a lot of those inquiries, and sometimes there's important questions in there, but often it's just giving you a nudge, like let me know, and then following up a few weeks later with another one. They're not always the most welcome thing. That's kind of just a little between us, off the record thing. But I think once the film is submitted, the festival will watch that. We will watch that film. We will get back to you and let you know. Only really contact if there's anything that really needs to be communicated. The link has changed or expired, for example. We need to know that. That's important. But otherwise, let us do our job. Hopefully the film will speak to itself and you'll hear back.
And I think as well, a lot of, or for me, when I was a student as well, to go just after graduating, was I was putting a lot of energy into worrying about what festivals I was getting into, and but not necessarily think about what festivals would be good for me as a young filmmaker to attend, regardless of if I got in or not. And kind of since then, and that film's kind of done, I've attended a lot more festivals just as I guess more of a punter, but from a filmmaker like site, and particularly like BFI Flair and London Film Festival as well. The kind of the industry sides of events that you do have as well are completely invaluable to both like learning and inspiration and all of that as well. So how do you go about curating events, which you touched on a bit before? How do you go about that? And
I think, again, it's always different for each festival, so I'm senior programmer across both BFI festivals, Flair and LFF. Both are very different processes in putting that together, and both are very different processes in putting together the events programs, for example. And like I said before, with the events, you'll have public events and then you'll have industry events. So there's different kind of layers to each side of that. For London Film Festival, it's our industry events program is much broader. We have a much higher number of industry delegates. When I'm talking about this as well, I'm kind of talking about the festival in what might be a normal year. At the moment, the festival, the London Film Festival we had this year was a hybrid edition of partly in venues, but mostly online. And with that, the kind of industry side of things, the event side of things was dramatically reduced. So, it's kind of not necessarily reflective of the previous year that's just happened, but with in a normal year, we'll have a full program of industry events. There'll be activities mostly every day that people can go to. They might be small panel discussions or talks. They might be pitching and networking events, et cetera. There's many across, and the public facing stuff is usually directly related, of course, to film, but also to themes coming out of the program, individual or separate discussions on specific films or topics that are rising. It might be director screen talks that we'll be putting on. Whereas with BFI Flair, I think we can be a little bit more playful with what we do sometimes. And because Flair is a queer film event, we often do things that service and speak to and are there for queer communities that aren't always directly linked to films in the program. And sometimes we can do things that aren't even linked directly to film. Recent discussions that we've been having is for Flare this year, thinking about mental health, thinking about mental health kind of support that we could be offering during the festival. How does that function within a film festival? Does that have to be linked to a film, or could be something we just think is interesting to do to serve a community and support a community who are going through a really hard time at the moment? So I think, you know, it's just a little way to kind of explain how every festival is different in the way that you program it. But I think that kind of fits into what you were saying, Lewis, about as a filmmaker thinking about the festival that works for you, not just focusing on trying to get your film in everywhere, and, you know, thinking about that, what can that festival, you know, is that festival going to say yes? It's like thinking about what can that festival do for me if I went to that festival? What does exhibiting at that festival mean? What are the conversations that could start out of that experience is a really important part of it. So I think it all comes back to, you know, the filmmaker, the kind of industry, the audience, whoever is thinking about what the festival is and what it can be for them. And, you know, if they find that right fit, you can get so much out of that experience. I was going to say also just one other thing, thinking about submissions, and we were talking about what you can do to get your film noticed, or, you know, the best way to kind of submit to a film festival. But the other thing that I'd say is that we see a huge amount of films every year, and only a very small amount of those films make it into the final program. Only a small amount of those get selected for the festival. That's not the final selection isn't fully representative of all the films that we liked. It's not fully representative of all the films that we responded to and we discussed and went through different selection processes. You know, there's always many more films than we have space to screen, and difficult decisions have to be made. You know, space is the fundamental and the primary thing that we're thinking about. You have a limited number of slots, so you have a limited number of films that you can choose from, but also we think about diversity, about representation, about difference existing throughout the full program. So, for example, if you were to see, you know, 3 feature films that were dealing with very similar subject matters, you loved them all, but they were really saying very similar things overall, then it's unlikely that you would select all 3 of them. You know, you might think we'll do 2, maybe we can only do 1 of them, because we want to make sure that we're finding space for different kinds of filmmaking, different types of stories, different filmmaking voices. So quite often films that don't make it into the festival, so technically get kind of rejected, might have been films that we really responded to, that we really liked. It's, for me, with BFI Flare, for example, because we have fewer films submitted to us, I always try to find the time to write personal notes back to filmmakers to let them know that we did respond really well to their film, but sadly it didn't make it to the final selection. Excuse me. But with bigger festivals like the London Film Festival, you know, by the end of the year in programming, we have a database with all the records of the films we've considered. At the end of the year, we'll probably have around 5,000 records on that year's database. It's an impossible task to get back individually, you know, with a personal bespoke email to everyone. So, you know, if you were to get a kind of thank you for submitting, but sadly your film has not been successful, it might not always be fully representative, and it's hard to take that as anything but a rejection, but don't let it be disheartening. You know, you can be rejected from, you know, 10 festivals in a row. It doesn't mean those 10 festivals didn't respond to the film, and it doesn't mean you're not going to get into the 11th festival. You know, basically, I'm kind of long-winded saying if a rejection from a film festival isn't someone reaching back and saying your film is bad. There's many reasons which go into the selection process. So don't be disheartened if you do face rejections, which, you know, invariably you will. That's the kind of process of applying to film fests.
Definitely. And you said about how many kind of things are in your database. Someone has asked how many people are in your team that are responsible for programming the festival, and I suppose does that change throughout the year as well in the kind of timeline of approaching the festival?
Yeah, for London Film Festival, there's it's, in terms of the kind of in-house team, myself, I work very closely with Trisha Tuttle, who's the artistic director of BFI Festivals, and then work with 2 other in-house programmers who are the kind of year-round team that work on LFF, and then we work with around 25 external advisors who, as I mentioned before, are regional specialists or specialists in specific film form. so that we kind of work with them, the external advisors, at different points in the year. There's kind of downtime with them, and then there's time, in the months running up to Programme Lock for London Film Festival. We'll be engaging with conversations with them, almost every day, talking about films that they're seeing. That team is, kind of changes and evolves sometimes. We have new people come in, people leave. It's very much about making sure that we have a balance that's consistent, that we feel like we're kind of, have people that are kind of experts within certain types of filmmaking or filmmaking styles, but also that we have, diversity across the team in all different ways in terms of the voices. The film festival, the end program is a collective effort. So we want to make sure that all those voices are kind of heard throughout. With BFI Flair, it's a much smaller team. It's myself, and I work with 5 external programmers. We program, and like with London Film Festival, we will have our specialist areas of interests. One of my colleagues, Zorian, one of the programs we work with, for example, specializes in trans films. Myself, I look kind of mostly at the kind of male focused narratives. We mix these up. We're not prescriptive in what we watch and what we do. I think it's really important that you're looking, again, outside of personal interest, that you're sharing each other's films, you're watching the other films that programs are recommending, so you can understand their tastes. It develops and it moves on the conversation forward, and it also just means that you're creating something, again, like I said, that feels like a kind of collective effort. It doesn't feel like things are kind of siloed off into different areas.
And on the note as well of the team, this is a question about, I suppose, people getting into the area of what you do within planning the festival from that side of it. So how would, if someone from more of an events background that doesn't necessarily have an interest in film, but not in like a practical or theoretical educational film, how could they fit into that environment what kind of job roles are available for that?
Yeah, so there's in terms of London Film Festival, for example, there's loads of different roles. A lot of people that work on the festival come from, that work in, say, the press teams, events teams, sponsorship teams. They don't all come from film backgrounds. They haven't all kind of studied film. I think film is always a kind of an interest, a fundamental interest that people have. It's something that draws them to work at BFI and to work on festivals, but it's not a prerequisite in terms of working on the festival. I think when it comes to programming, when it comes to the more kind of specific film curation stuff, a kind of knowledge and a background in film is important. But at the same time, it's, thinking about qualifications, it's that you don't have to obviously have a degree in programming. You don't have to have a degree in film studies. There's other ways that experience informs those opportunities. I think, something that people often ask me is like, how do I get into programming? What are some kind of tips that you can do? And it's a tough one because programming jobs don't come up a huge amount. It's particularly year-round programming jobs. I'm in a very fortunate position where I have a full-time film programming gig. Most of the people that we work with do programming as a kind of side role, alongside, the kind of main job that they have or other freelance work that they do. But the most important thing that you can do is, of course, be watching films, building a knowledge of films, building your own voice in terms of how you talk about film and how you think about film, thinking about film from different perspectives, thinking about different audiences who watches films. I think a really key thing to do is watch films outside of your areas of interest. Watch films from filmmakers, from countries, from, that deal with topics that you don't usually watch, that maybe aren't even of interest to you. Watch different forms, watch experimental cinema, watch documentary filmmaking. Just think about the different kind of models and modes of filmmaking, and through doing that, understand and find your own voice. Something that I always look for if I'm thinking about if we're looking to recruit a new programmer, is everyone will come with that fundamental, like, I love film, that's why I want to program. I love film, I know everything about film, I'm a walking IMDb. That's it's good to a certain extent, but it's not really of interest to me. What I want is, what is your personal point of view when it comes to film, and what is the specific area of film that you feel you know more about than anyone else, you have a greater understanding of. And that isn't necessarily an understanding of in terms of, as I said, an encyclopedic knowledge. It's about why that cinema is important, the audiences it speaks to, why we need to find space for it in the London Film Festival, for example. So I think, you know, specialism is a really important thing. Knowing who you are, what your tastes are, and what you have to offer is a huge thing. There's a million people out there that love films and can talk about films, but there's only one person that can talk about film in the way that you can. So harnessing and specializing, refining those areas of specialism and expertise are really, really important. And often you'll find that if programming jobs do come up, quite often they are for specific specialist areas. It might be, as I said, you know, experimental artist moving image work, or it might be someone looking for someone to program, you know, sub-Saharan African work, for example. You know, knowing where your expertise lie, know that you'd be applying, or you'd be kind of looking towards the right programming job that's the right fit for you.
And are there any, other than, I guess, like internships, as someone's pointed out here, other than those, are there any entry level kind of roles or even volunteer roles, I suppose, at the festivals that can help you develop the understanding of how a festival runs, the different roles that are involved, and perhaps network with those people that you could speak to about potential like employment opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pretty much all festivals kind of couldn't function without volunteers. We use them across both festivals, and volunteering is a really great thing to do, because with volunteering, you can kind of get as much or as little out of it as you want to. So, you know, you can do it and you can come, you can do a couple of events, help out with something, volunteer, and it's great. But you really commit yourself to to being there for the full kind of couple of weeks of the festival. You know, you have access to speaking with filmmakers, you could have access to attending some different events. There are little perks that come with it. Obviously, you can get to see some films and stuff. So it's a really great way to get an overview of film festivals, a little kind of behind the scenes understanding of how they work. And it's a great place as well to make connections. I mean, I would never suggest someone volunteers with the intention to make connections, because, you know, at the same time, it's like you're there to work and to help out, and, you know, you're not there just for your, you know, to network and stuff. But, you know, if you can find the balance of the two, I think you can make some really interesting, important contacts. It also gives you a chance to speak to the other people that work on the festival, to work in the different teams, whether it's events, marketing, sponsorship, press, program, loads of different things. And then through those conversations, asking people about their jobs and what they do, it can help you understand maybe what you might want to do as part of this, where you might fit in, what your expertise might be. And then through those conversations, you can ask those people advice on how to get there. How do you do that? You know, are there specific qualifications you need? Are there specific experiences that you need elsewhere? If you don't have those experiences, you know, what else could you do to kind of be seen and to make it known that you are interested and you're capable, and, you know, you're enthusiastic about entering the world of film festivals. So there's lots of ways that volunteering is a great start. I mentioned at the beginning that I started work at BFI as an intern in the marketing department. And as I said, I wasn't interested in film marketing. I just wanted to get into BFI. I wanted to make that first step and make those connections, which I did. So, you know, I think it's always useful to not to be too kind of blinkered in what it is that you might want to be doing. If you wanted to pursue a job in programming, your first kind of entry level point might not be programming, and probably wouldn't be programming. Quite often it might be on one of the kind of peripheral roles, or a supporting role on a festival, for example, in which case, you know, if you prove your dedication and your interest, that could be a way that you could develop, which is what happened for me. So I think, yeah, being, you know, having an understanding of what it is and where you want to go, but also being open to the path that might get you there might be not the most direct one. And along that path, you might actually be led in a kind of different direction. So many different parts to a festival, there's so many different, you know, things that are so important and can be so creative as well, that sit outside of programming.
Someone asks, when applying for film festivals, would you suggest you applying for bigger festivals like the BFI London Film Festivals, the Sundances, or to apply for more specialist festivals relating to your film, such as like experimental or genre-based film festivals?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's case by case. It really depends on the film itself. I think that, for example, if you are submitting an piece of experimental film that you've made to a film festival, that bit of research that I talked about before, which is really important, is, how much space does this festival, for example, dedicate to experimental work? Does it dedicate any space to experimental work at all? Understanding that if you think your film, and you realistically see that your film has a place in that festival, if you think that your film, your film should be considered for BFI London Film Festival, 100% submit it to Sundance, submit it to Cannes, submit it to everyone. Just be realistic about what you're doing, but also just be thoughtful, like I said, about resource and also money that you might be investing in doing this. If this money could be spent or invested elsewhere in other ways that you could be promoting the film and bringing the film to audiences, rather than kind of reaching for the stars straight out and spending a lot of money on festivals and finding that you're not getting in. I think starting at small festivals is a great place to do. It gives you a really important kind of understanding, like a kind of microcosm of how a film festival might work. And essentially, whether film festival is a tiny little bespoke niche regional festival, or it's a huge international one, the kind of essence is the same. The scale is different, the resource is different, but the fundamental thing of what they do, what they want to do, which is provide filmmakers with a great experience, showcase what they deem to be the best in kind of contemporary film, and have kind of basically speak to audiences, give audiences a good time. That's the same across the board. So starting small, there's a lot to be said for that. Finding your feet in smaller festivals is a great place to start.
Definitely. Someone asks, what's the most important part of your job?
I think the most important part is recognizing that you are a kind of a gatekeeper to a certain extent. Like, you are one of a group of people who is responsible for what does or doesn't get shown. I think there's a responsibility that comes with that. And I think it's really important to recognize that and to be really thoughtful and smart in the choices that you're making. What the decisions that you're making can have a big impact on people, on individuals, on filmmakers, but also they can be really impactful, influential on audiences in making sure that people feel seen on screen when often they don't. Part of BFI Flair, it's really important, that festival as a community event, it's really important as a place where people can feel represented, can feel seen, can feel safe, making sure that we have, that there are those films that we know that are going to sell out and they're going to do really well, but it's important to kind of balance those with smaller films that might be harder sells. It might be harder to find those audiences for them, small niche documentaries that maybe don't have that kind of glitzy wow factor that, there's going to be stars on the red carpet. But those smaller films, those quieter films, more delicate films, are a really important part of the festival. And it's really important in creating a whole, like a kind of holistic thing that can speak to as many different people as possible. So I think the most important thing is recognizing the sense of responsibility that comes with that. And I think that refers back to when I was talking about taste, that personal taste shouldn't always be the defining factor in when you make a decision. And to the same extent, personal experience shouldn't always be the defining factor. What is meaningful to you and what speaks to you is not the same thing that will speak to lots of different audiences. So, to that extent, for example, if I was watching a feature film by a trans filmmaker dealing with, a young trans person coming out, I can experience that film. I can find my own understanding in that film. But as someone who's not lived a trans experience, my understanding and what it means to me has a limit. So it's important that I'm sharing that film with other programmers, that I'm having those conversations, I'm understanding it from different points of view. I think that, you can never be so bold as to think that your taste, your understanding is the end point of something. It's absolutely not. And so being open to hearing other people's opinions and deferring to other people's opinions, I think, is such a hugely important part of the job.
What are on your, well, I suppose for you personally then, are there any filmmakers or films of the last couple of years that you've seen that you would recommend to anyone, but I suppose for filmmakers, emerging filmmakers, that are by people that perhaps they don't know? Who are the names and what are the films that come to mind when you think of will be big in the future, or that we should really look to now?
Yeah. God, I need to think about it. Give me a second. Let me just have that in the back of my mind. It's like I always do that thing. It's like the one thing that I always find is someone's always like, "Oh, what should I watch?" Or what's a kind of the best film you've seen recently? And I'm like, "Oh, suddenly I draw a complete blank because I've seen so much recently." But let me just bear that. Let's come back to that at the end.
That's
let me think about some good names. But yeah, I mean, I think that the thing about festivals is. Festivals are really important, I think, for discovery. Festivals are really important spaces to take risks and to take chances. So, I think it's a great question, because it's like when you're presented with a lot of films by filmmakers you don't know, films that you've never heard of before, it's like, how do you begin to make choices? How do you begin to see different things? And I think when someone says to me, what's your favorite film in this edition of BFI Flair, or what's a film that I should see, I always just kind of say, like, I'm not going to tell you a film to watch, like, but if you can just take a risk on something, buy your tickets for those films that you want to see, but just take a punt, buy a ticket for something that you just have no idea, you just saw the still for it in the brochure and you really liked it, you thought it looked really beautiful. That's enough. Just expand your horizons. There's so few opportunities, I think, that we have to do that, particularly in cinemas. Obviously not so much in cinemas at the moment, but in cinemas, to be exposed to films that you've never heard of, you've got no understanding of, you've never seen a film from that country, for example. It's like, take a risk on it, go and watch it. It could completely shift how you see film, could completely shape and transform your film tastes moving forward. So yeah, I think that festivals is, fundamentally should be, and always should be, about kind of risk taking. Again, this is all part of the thing that I was saying, like, I sit down to watch every film like, this is going to be great. That's what I say to myself before I press play on any film that I'm watching for festivals. Like, this is going to be great. Like, this is going to be, this is going to kind of blow my mind. And going in with that kind of positive thought, that kind of positive attitude is really helpful, because I think otherwise you can just have this endless list of films that you've got to watch and everything feels like a slog. You need to approach each one fresh and new, and with this sense of excitement and discovery. And I think audiences should do the same thing.
Definitely. It's so true what you say, that it's so rare that we go in blind to watch something and experience something, especially with, obviously, all cinemas, you go in to watch something in particular, and usually it's because the IP and the franchise and the star that's in it. Whereas festivals, I discovered my favorite film a couple of years ago at a festival that was, I was on a jury for a film festival, and I spent the whole week watching films. And then for the last one came on, I was like, oh, it'd be great if this is the best film by far, and it makes our decision really easy. And we had to and it started at 9 p.m, finished at 11 o'clock, and we were supposed to say by midnight what our final kind of hand-in was for the film. And it's just kind of, going in blind is such a different experience, and it opens you up so much more. That's why I think any opportunity to have accessible cinema where you can, for shorts and features, is so important.
What was the film?
And Then We Danced by
Levinak.
because it played at Flair as well, I think.
Yeah.
It was, amazing. I think he's just shot his second feature, actually, so I'm quite excited about that. Someone has a question. Do you have any tips for maintaining personal interest and passion for something once it becomes part of your job? Which I know you touched on before.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a good question, isn't it? It's such a hard thing to kind of quantify, to kind of put into words. I mean, I really genuinely believe that if you love film, for example, if you really truly love it, and you start doing a job like this, you start to work in program or you work in film, that keeping that personal love and that personal interest alive is easy. You know, it's about, like I said, I think it's just about, you know, separating enough that you're doing one for one purpose and you're doing one for the other purpose, but letting those two things bleed into each other. You know, as I said before, I'm never going to sit down to watch films for work and be like, oh God, I've got to watch this for work. I'm like, I'm sitting down to watch a film. Like, life could be so much worse right now. You know, bringing that joy, bringing that enjoyment, and bringing that sense of excitement and promise with each film. I think it's really important to do those things and to keep that. For me, that's how I keep both going. I think that it's really important to know why you started doing it. You started doing it because you have this really pure love for something. You know, don't become complacent in that. You know, remind yourself constantly how you love it. And it's easy to do when you're, you know, when you're programming or when you're working at film festivals, because you're constantly exposed to great films. You know, you're constantly reminded why you love film. You're constantly watching films that reinvigorate your love and your passion and make you think in different ways. So, you know, for me, it's an easy thing. I think that, you know, if your love is pure, you'll hold on to it.
Great advice. So I'm interested, if we do, again, at the beginning, we kind of touched on with COVID impacting everything, but you still managed to, every festival has still managed to happen in some form since the pandemic last year. What's that transition like? And I guess what have you adapted to that will now be, if anything, that you'll take forward on a permanent basis?
Yeah, it's been super tough. Like the last couple of, well, this past year, I think last March, BFI Flair was in 2020 was like one of the first big kind of cultural events to have to be cancelled, and we kind of had to pivot to an online edition like 2 days before the festival was about to start.
Wow. And
we had a really small selection, like 9 films out of the program. We managed to host online and do some filmmaker Q&As and stuff. So we did something pretty quickly, and it was great what we managed to do, but it was devastating. The loss of the festival, the work that had gone into it, the months of doing that, the filmmakers that were supposed to be coming, to have to, you know, cancel just 2 days before we started was so difficult. But from then, London Film Festival, as I mentioned, was a kind of hybrid edition, because back in October, there was that time when suddenly we were kind of allowed to go out for a bit, and we were allowed to do kind of socially distanced cinema screenings. But now with March coming around again for BFI Flair, we are hosting this year's Flair entirely online. So it's going to be completely digital. It's going to be a reduced program to what we normally have. We normally have around 55 to 60 feature films in Flair. This is going to be 25 features. And we normally have around 80 shorts or so. And this is going to be about just under 40 shorts. So it's, you know, half the size of the festival. And I think with that comes lots of compromise, lots of difficult decisions that have to be made, lots of reevaluating, like, what is the festival, what do we want to be saying with it? If we've got a significantly smaller program, what choices do we make about the films? What films do we prioritize? How do we balance the fact that a film festival is also needs to be commercially viable? We need to sell tickets, we need to be sustainable, but at the same time, you don't want to do that at the expense of those smaller films, those films that you know aren't going to sell as many tickets, but are really culturally important and really shape and change the feel of the festival overall. So doing that balancing act. So yeah, but I think it's one of those things, it sounds like it's all doom and gloom, and it's been a very difficult thing to do. But one of the great things about moving online, especially with Flair this year, is it's the first time ever that the entire Flair program will be accessible UK wide. It's online. Suddenly the festival is no longer the London LGBTIQ plus film festival. It's like the UK queer film festival. You can see it anywhere. You can see it wherever you are. We're also making all the short films available online for free. So you can watch those wherever you are, whenever you want to, for the 12 days of the festival. So while in many ways it feels like we've been faced with all these restrictions and we've had to make changes and compromises, we've actually opened up the festival in ways that we never have before. And the most important thing as a programmer is reaching audiences, is sharing films, essentially being a programmer. It's that thing like, when you love a film, the first thing you want to do is tell your friends that you loved it and to watch it too. That's what you do. That's what a programmer is. You just get paid to do it, and you just do it with lots of people you've never met before. So it's like there's an opportunity this year in this kind of online model that you can do that with, you know, thousands more people than you ever have before. And I think that feels like so important at the moment. I think, you know, people are isolated, and I think isolation within queer communities can impact in different ways. And I think having something that can be a kind of community moment, something that kind of can unite people, you know, through film, is really vital and really essential at the moment. So I'm definitely looking at it as the positives, what online means in how people access film. And I think that means moving forward, once you've done something, once you've had to really tear something apart and kind of start from the ground up again, you know, rebuild a festival, reimagine exactly what it is and what you want it to be, you can never revert back to the thing that it once was before. So, you know, for London Film Festival, you know, we're thinking about this year, 2021 edition, how we can make still a portion of that, fingers crossed, if we're able to be back in cinemas, we can still be presenting films online. We can still be making sure that there's a portion of the program that's accessible to audiences UK wide. You know, you can't open something out like that and then take it all away again. So I think that this past year has actually been really informative, thinking about who we're reaching and why we want to reach them. And once you've had an opportunity to reach more people, why would you want to go back to fewer?
Definitely. Did you find that was part of the reason that not as many films were available online because of distributors wanting theatrical releases, and kind of, yeah, what was the reasoning behind that, I suppose?
Yeah, it was it's been difficult. It's been, I think, when we first year, like with Flare last year, when we first kind of had to pivot to a very kind of swift online model, it was very difficult having those negotiations with rights holders, distributors, filmmakers, when they were like, what does it mean? What does it mean to put my film online? How many people can see it? How are you going to monitor this? How are we going to make sure that film's not pirated, et cetera, et cetera? You know, those conversations were difficult, and we were working them out as well ourselves as we went. When it came through to London Film Festival, you know, we'd moved slightly into a climate where online festivals had started to be happening. There was an understanding about the kind of landscape of them. There was an understanding in the industry about what they meant and the value of them. So those conversations were made slightly easier. And now Flare this year, you know, I feel like we live in this kind of online world at the moment more than ever. And those conversations have been very clear and easy to have, and very understandable for filmmakers, rights holders, etc. The main reason for the Flare reduction in program this year is because it's very resource heavy for us in lots of ways to put together an online program in ways that you wouldn't even imagine. You'd think it'd be much easier than doing the in-venue festival, but actually it's more complicated in lots of ways. But something that's really important to us this year is accessibility. So accessibility in terms of reaching audiences UK wide, but also in terms of making sure that the films themselves are accessible. So investing money in closed captioning and audio description across English language films, which is a process that takes a lot of time, and it can be quite a costly process too. So kind of thinking about where we can best put our resource into access means slimming down the program. It means reducing things, but we can do something that's truly accessible, and we do something that still maintains and kind of retains the heart of what we want to do. And it feels like Flare, it feels like the festival, but it's just a slightly, you know, kind of condensed version of what it might normally be.
And will the festival be kind of fusing with BFI Player as well?
Yeah,
accessible through there or through web?
Yeah, so BFI Player is the streaming platform that we use. So it's, you can kind of buy tickets like you would through on a normal festival. You buy them on the festival website, and then you can watch them through BFI Player. We'll be doing like recorded introductions and Q&As with filmmakers, so you can have that kind of full festival experience at home, where you can watch the filmmaker before, you can hear from them afterwards. So we try and do everything that replicates that festival experience as much as you can, but yeah, just sadly not in the cinemas this year.
Not just yet. Am I right in thinking for London Film Festival last year, you also did a live screenings across the UK at participating cinemas?
Yeah, we did.
How was that, and is that something you're like considering going forward for the festival as well? Because again, it widens audiences and makes it more accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for LFF, we definitely want to do that. We want to think about how we're reaching other regional cinemas and kind of connecting and making that, I think we're conscious that we don't want the kind of UK-wide aspect to that accessibility aspect to revert to only being online. Part of film experiences and part of festivals is about being in a cinema, is about kind of sharing that experience with other people. So we want to make sure that that's another addition to it as well. So lots of work to do to understand how we're going to do that, but very much we're thinking about reaching and kind of working with cinemas outside of London.
No, it'd be brilliant going forward for sure. Right, okay, just see any other questions down here.
I was just thinking about, as we've been talking in the background, I'm thinking about like recent films that I've loved and filmmakers to look out for. I was thinking that someone who I really love is a filmmaker called Aleem Khan, who made a film called After Love, which we had in the London Film Festival last year. Really wonderful film about a woman kind of discovering secrets about her husband after his death. Really beautiful, melancholic, slow kind of internal film that's really beautifully made. Aleem is a filmmaker who we've had a kind of long history with BFI Flair. He was we have a mentorship scheme for emerging and upcoming LGBTIQ+ filmmakers, directors, producers, writers, and we pair them up with a mentor, an established person within the industry. And Aleem was part of that some years ago, and we've shown his work in Flair before, and this was his debut feature, and it was in London Film Festival. It's a really wonderful film, so I'd recommend checking that out and looking at his career. He's read a really interesting kind of trajectory and working on these kind of small little no budget short films to having this film now that's doing the rounds at the international film festivals.
Amazing. I think, has that been picked up by Peccadillo?
Yeah, I think it's Peccadillo.
Yeah, I do remember kind of seeing a poster, I think, on their social media. So I'm using a wireless mouse trying to control this, and it's a little bit iffy. So on I'm more of like a personal note, what films interest you? Am I right in thinking you're a horror fan?
Yeah, I'm a big horror fan.
Is that what piqued your interest in film, like quite early on? Was it horror, or is that something that you kind of discovered through, like, over time?
Yeah, I was always obsessed with horror movies since I was a little kid. Luckily, fortunately, I had a mum who kind of, I think, saw pretty early that I wasn't scared or traumatized before them. I was with them. I was just kind of fascinated. So she pretty much would just kind of plop me down and let me watch whatever I wanted. But yeah, horror films my big passion. I program, one of my kind of specialist areas at London Film Festival is I program the cult strand, which is the kind of genre stuff. So particularly horror work that we show in the London Film Festival. I oversee the curation and selection of that. So that's my big kind of nerdy passion. I do lots of stuff outside, lots of kind of writing on horror films as well. But my taste is super broad. I mean, it wasn't horror that necessarily ignited my love of film when I was younger. I just always was obsessed with film. Horror was just the thing that I was particularly drawn to. But it's genuinely one of those, like, I like all types of film, all types of genre, all types of kind of filmmaking. I have a very kind of broad interest and a very big kind of appetite for different types and kind of watching as much as I can. I think I've always had just that appetite to consume and to watch and to discuss. which has obviously come in handy now because that's literally all I do for will be part of what I do for work. So yeah, but I think it goes back to that thing as well that I was saying about having specialist areas of interest are really helpful when you're programming. With the horror stuff, as I said, I kind of, I write lots about horror films. I do, kind of podcasts and talk about horror films and things like that. So it's something that I'm kind of known for doing, and I do that, and I have that specialist knowledge. But at the same time, I have interests that exist and I have expertise that exists outside of that too. So I think there's a balance, isn't there, between kind of having specialism but also allowing it not to be only that. There's a kind of balancing act that you can do there, because I think quite often people don't want to be kind of pigeonholed in just being one thing. So for me, it's been really important, and my programming work at Flare and London Film Festival has been really essential in me having a voice in broader kind of world cinema and being really instrumental in that industry. But yeah, that down underneath it all, I'm a total horror nerd at heart.
Brilliant. Right. What's the best way to destigmatize and normalize LGBT plus relationships in films as an ally? So as an ally filmmaker.
Oh, that's such a good question. I think it's a huge question. So in terms of, is the question about kind of normalizing how to normalize LGBT or queer representations on film in the films that you're making, like how to tell stories that normalize?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think, I think there's absolutely not one answer to that. I think we find ourselves in this place where there's equal demand for queer representation that is not central to stories, as in queer characters aren't the main characters, but their queerness is not the thrust of the narrative. I think there's an appetite to see films in which queer people just exist in films and have lives outside of that. They have stories that involve other things that happen in their life rather than just a queer relationship or a coming out experience or whatever it might be. So I think there's definitely an appetite for that. And I think that the normalizing of that, the more we just see queer people on screen living lives, is really important. I think that is something that does normalize. But at the same time, I think that there will never not be an appetite for explicitly queer narratives and stories, and to keep telling those and to keep telling different ones. We you see similar queer narratives over and over again. I see this as I program for BFI Flare. You see coming out stories a lot, of course, but you see a lot of coming out stories about young white men. They're the films that we see probably the most. How can you tell different stories? Who should be making different stories? Why are we only hearing from certain perspectives all the time? So I think there's, it's kind of, guess my answer is twofold, whether it's that idea of normalizing queer experience and not, allowing queer characters to exist outside of their queerness on film, or telling more focused queer stories that aren't currently being told on screen. I think both of those things are equally important. I'm not someone necessarily that wants to normalize. I think that I'm often asked the question, like, why does BFI Flare still exist? Like, why do you need a queer film festival? Because you can see queer films on Netflix. You can, you pop on, I don't know, Riverdale, and there's a host of queer characters in there. Like, why do we need a queer film festival? And I think there is something about shared experience, and I think there's something about reflection on screen and on cinema screens. I think there's something about a collective focused celebration that's so important. I would never want to reach a point where we don't need queer festivals because we have representation everywhere. I think creating those spaces is always so important to me, creating specifically queer spaces in which people can exist and feel safe and feel celebratory, and all of those kind of things are so exciting. So I guess I think about what we need to do in terms of representation, how far we've got to come in terms of representation before I think about what we have to do in terms of normalizing.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, like you're saying there as well, a lot of films can almost only exist in kind of like queer festival spaces, or with like a queer audience, because that's how they're made. Some of the discussions are only, I think, in the idea of normalizing, there can also be a habit of shying away from negative aspects of so yeah, sorry, I was just saying, in trying to normalize too much, you can also shy away from the negative aspects of things that you want to discuss, which I think are kind of usually done in this kind of safe community environment of where there's a shared like queer experience. Whereas some things might be more seen as more like shocking or like crazy to a heteronormative, like cis white gaze, essentially, which opens up. Interesting, we've got Russell T Davis doing a discussion with us on Wednesday, and of course from Queer as Folk onwards, he's been very much, obviously he's kind of garnered a wider net of audience, like beyond just a queer audience, but primarily that is his, like with Queer as Folk, for example, that is more who it was made for, and then of widening there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's always really interesting to me, and part of things that's interesting about festivals and, you know, film exhibition more broadly, is the different experiences you can have in different situations. So for example, if, you know, this year, well, quite often we might have a queer film that's in London Film Festival, and then we'll screen it again in March at BFI Flair. And you could go to both those screenings. You go to LFF, watch the film, be like, oh, I love that, I'll go and see it again when it's at BFI Flair, and have a very different experience watching that film. You know, the Q&A itself, you know, the tone of it, the depth of conversation might be a bit different at Flair than it was at LFF. The reactions from the audiences might be different. The conversations that come out afterwards might be different. I'm always really interested about how environment and space can shape an experience and understanding of a film. I think it's really important that we have all of those different spaces available. So I think this is, again, going back to the thing that I was saying about, you know, I would never want to get to a point where I feel like we don't need queer festivals, because we always need them, because it just generates a different conversation. I'm talking about queer festivals, but I could be talking about specialist genre festivals. I could be talking about, you know, the Jewish Film Festival. It's, you know, these are all, you know, they exist for a reason. They exist for a reason beyond the simple exhibition of film. So I think it's something else to think about if you are interested in programming, is what festivals and festival spaces mean in terms of the experience of film, and the you know, what it means, what those films mean to different audiences in different spaces and different kind of communities. But also goes back to the thing we were saying about, as a filmmaker, if you're submitting films to different festivals, what films make sense for you? What films make sense for that? What festivals make sense for that film? What are the conversations that will come out of that? What's going to be the audience responses? You know, where does your film find its natural home? Target those festivals, focus on that. They don't have to be the biggest film festivals. You know, the right one is not often the main one. But, you know, if think about the work that your film will be shown against, you know, look at the kind of films that are usually shown in that film festival. Is your film a kind of comfortable bedfellow with that film, or would it kind of stick out like a sore thumb in a different festival? The latter could be really good, but also it could be not damaging for the film, but it could not be the best place that it would screen.
I think that wraps things up quite nicely on the need and the passion for cinema. Thank you very much for taking the time and joining us this afternoon. It's been really interesting, and it's been good to catch up.
Cool, thanks. I'll just say that we're because we're just locking the program for BFI Flair at the moment, and then we are announcing the lineup on the 23rd of February, 2 weeks time. So keep an eye out, have a look, come and watch some stuff. It's going to be a good lineup this year.
Definitely, I'm excited to see what's on there. Thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you in the not too distant future.
Cool. Thanks, Lewis.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Michael. Bye.